So I'm Tim Glassman. I'm a visiting fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. And welcome to the third installment of our roughly monthly series that we call the Disruptors that we started in the fall with Peter Thiel. And the Disruptors is part of the program of a new center that we started at AEI in September of 2013 called the Center for Internet, Communications, and Technology Policy. And I hope you'll all visit our Tech Policy Daily site. We now have 15 visiting fellows who are involved in issues that range from telecom policy to privacy to cybersecurity. And certainly all of those subjects have to do with innovation. So let me before I introduce Walter, let me just tell you how I met Walter, which is a story that he's heard before, and in fact even participated in. So
it has the odious smell of truth to it as well.
I know. There's not that much truth to it, but I was this 25-year-old guy who thought he was something of a hotshot, starting a weekly newspaper in New Orleans, and we were up and running for a few months, and somebody said, "You need to meet this guy." Now he's 19 years old. You were either still in high school, or maybe
story gets better every time.
Maybe you were a freshman at Harvard, but you're a young guy. And so this guy comes over, and he told me everything I needed to know about running this newspaper. And actually, you had some good ideas, Walter.
Actually. My wife always uses the word actually on those rare occasions when I have a good idea.
So Walter went on to graduate from Harvard. He went to Oxford and had a distinguished career as a journalist, was the editor of Time Magazine, CEO of CNN, and has gone on to become the CEO, started, I think, 2003. He became CEO of the Aspen Institute. And in his spare time has written some of the most important biographies of the last several years, biography of Einstein, of Benjamin Franklin, of Henry Kissinger, of the six wise men, including Dean Acheson and that group, and then his fabulous biography of Steve Jobs that came out in 2011, one of the biggest bestsellers in recent years. Walter also among his many other accomplishments was the chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, in which he followed me, and you were also vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Commission, I think it was called. Walter and I, as I said, have New Orleans in common, and we also have journalism in common, and we're very happy that you're all here tonight to hear a discussion and to participate in a discussion of his new book, The Innovators, which I'll hold up. And so I just wanted to start, and we'll have questions from the audience after a few questions from me, but I just want to start because you begin this book, curiously enough, with Lord Byron, who many would consider sort of the great romantic of his age. He was a Luddite. He certainly was could not be called a scientist. I mean, you actually start with his daughter, but really there's a lot in the very beginning about Lord Byron and about this combination between, I guess you would say, poetry and math, or humanities and science, which is a theme in a lot of your books. Mm-hmm. So tell us why the story of Innovators is really not just a story of science, but it's a story of poetry as well.
Well, you say Lord Byron was a Luddite, and that is literally true in that his only speech in the House of Lords was defending the followers of Ned Ludd, who were smashing the mechanical looms that were being built in industrial England in the 1820s on the theory that they were putting weavers out of work. Back then, people thought that technology might reduce the number of jobs. They were wrong then, just as they're wrong now. We've had Luddites ever since Thomas Ludd. And what Lord Byron objected to was that the artistic notion of these machines were being, is destroying the artisans who were doing it. His daughter was named Ada Byron, later Ada Lovelace, and her mother, Lady Byron, was not particularly fond of Lord Byron
Right.
by the time Ada was growing up. You have to know Lord Byron to understand why. He's a little bit too much of a romantic poet. And so had Ada tutored only in mathematics because she thought that would be an antidote to her becoming a romantic poet, as if understanding math is an antidote to being romantic or poetic.
Right.
So Ada loves both her father and her mother and sort of creates what she calls poetical science, which is this notion that poetry and beauty are connected to science, and that's where the value lays. Now, this resonated with me because the first long walk I took with Steve Jobs when we decided to do the book, as he said, he always loved to stand at that intersection of the arts and technology. And if you ever saw one of his product launches or see it on YouTube, you can look, the last slide on the screen is the intersection of two streets, the arts and technology. And he says that's where value is created. So Ada travels through industrial England to look at these looms and mechanical things that her father had been railing against, and sees how the punch cards are instructing them to make beautiful patterns. And she has a friend, Charles Babbage, who is making a numerical calculator called the analytical engine. And Ada realizes that by using punch cards, the analytical engine can do more than just numbers. And she writes and publishes, which is unusual for a woman in the 1830s, to publish in a serious scientific journal, that with the punch cards, the analytical engine can do more than just numbers. It can do patterns, it can do art, it can do words, it can do music. In other words, it can be a computer, as we would call it today. So she conceives of the notion of a general interest computer, and to me, that's the theme of the book. And the other theme of the book that comes from her is 100 years later, Alan Turing, who I hope to make more famous with this book, and then Benedict Cumberbatch plays him in a movie, and so my book is irrelevant. But he writes about the fact that the Imitation Game, the name of the movie, is his Turing test of how you can't tell a machine from a human, that we should make the distinction. And he calls that Ada Lovelace's objection. Because Ada says a machine will be able to do everything except one thing. It won't be able to think. It won't be able to be creative. It won't have human imagination. And so you have two schools of thought, the artificial intelligence school of Turing, and then the connection of the humanities to technology, which is Ada.
And she was completely sure of that right from the start. I think even before she got deeply into developing her computer. She said, machines can't think.
They won't have the imagination, it won't have the creativity. And this is still a debate, obviously. I mean, I'm sure in your ICT thing you deal with the issues of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, ever since Turing wrote The Imitation Game, Ada Lovelace paper in 1952, I think it is, it's always been 20 years away. And you can invite, if you want, even Peter Thiel, who you've had here, who will say, yes, we're about to get to artificial intelligence. It's only 20 years away. It's always 20 years away.
Yeah, yeah. Although she did say that the innovation, something like innovation comes from the combining.
The combining faculty, which is combining, that's what imagination comes from. And it's sort of combining things from diverse places, so that if you understand music and you understand math and you can combine things and come up with wholly new ideas. And computers do not originate new ideas. They only do what the algorithm instructs them to do. It's sort of theory.
What did you think of the movie?
Movie is great. I don't know if you all have seen it. I have an issue that, I'm not a big movie buff, but I am a big history buff. And so I get slightly antsy when history is messed up slightly. And there are parts of that movie that are literary license, I think is the word for fiction. I actually minded it much more in Selma, where it's just a blatant, horrible untruth that, say, Lyndon Johnson had J. Edgar Hoover send the sex tapes to Coretta King. And somebody said, I think it was the dumbest review I've ever read, it's some Washington Post movie critic says, oh, but he needed that to make a bridge scene, and so it's literally. No, you don't say that Lyndon Johnson sent sex tapes when he didn't just because you need to cut to the sex tapes. That's just wrong, it's a lie. And whatever you may think of Lyndon Johnson, he didn't do that, and you don't want generations to think he didn't do it. So that, to me, was one of the most jelly-minded things I had read, is this defense of, oh, yeah, you have to do it in order to have a scene cut or something. That said, there are things in the imitation game that bother me, but not at that level, such as, I don't know if you've seen it.
I have.
Yeah, John Cairncross, the Soviet spy
Right.
in the midst,
Right.
was not in HUD 8, did not work for Turing, and therefore they probably never even met. And there's a small drama in which Turing discovers Cairncross is a spy, but decides not to expose him because Cairncross knows he's gay.
Right.
That's a great plot device. It is historically incorrect. I don't know if there's I
That's
have a
too bad.
problem with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Is that literary license? Is that quite the same as fundamentally distorting history?
The other theme in your book is innovation comes from collaboration. That it's not so much one person doing something. It's these interesting combinations. It's, odd couples, I think you call them, Jobs and Wozniak and Noyce and Grove and Brin and Page and people like that.
Yeah.
So is that something new? Because we're all taught in school that inventions basically came from one person.
Right.
Is that the nature of the internet?
Well, it is partly true, more true of the digital revolution, which, as Ada says, involves the combining faculties, so you need this. But we biographers know in the back of our minds that we distort history. And we distort history by making it sound like there's a guy or a gal in a garage or a garret who has a light bulb moment and suddenly the light bulb appears. And that's not how inventions ever have happened. Stephen Johnson, who wrote a new book called How We Got to Now, shows this even better throughout history. I mean, whether it's, early inventions, that they tend to involve more collaboration than we say. But I think it's particularly true of the digital age. I mean, one example that I sort of start the main part of the book is there's a debate you can have on who invented the first computer. Partly it's Turing at Bletchley Park, England, doing the German codes. But there's a guy at Iowa State University named John Vincent Atanasoff. And if any of you have ever seen Jane Smiley, the novelist, writes a book, The Man Who Invented the Computer. It's the ultimate romantic thing of this guy in a basement at Iowa State coming up with the notion of a logical circuit that can do things. Well, it is a romantic thing of one guy, but Atanasoff couldn't get his machine working. The punch card burners never functioned. It never, joked. Because why? Because he's a lone guy working in a basement. He only, had a graduate student, and he used to take long drives in his Oldsmobile to think alone, and also I think to get to the Illinois border so you get liquor by the drink, which you couldn't get in Iowa. So he drank and tried to figure it out. The opposite is somebody who worked across the street, a guy named John Mauchly, who was sort of into the National Geographic Society, the Cosmos Club, the Smithsonian. He was one of these Washington scientist types who loved wood-paneled rooms like this almost, and loved to get
it'll be better.
Yeah, loved to get together, for meetings where they would share scientific papers. And so he goes around and tries to discover how to do a computer. And he's the ultimate collaborator type because he's clubby and all. He goes up to Dartmouth. He goes to Harvard where the Mark I is being, which is a non-digital computer, is being done by Grace Hopper and Howard Aiken. He goes to Bell Labs where Stibitz is doing things. He goes to the 1939 World's Fair. And then he even hears about this dude in Iowa, and he drives for 4 days to get to Iowa and spend some time with him looking at his machine. Now, as you can imagine, this becomes a field day for intellectual property lawyers. There are more lawsuits once ENIAC becomes UNIVAC, becomes Unisys, and they try to patent it, and all these people come out of the woodwork and say, you stole my idea, you stole my idea. But that's what they call stealing an idea is what we call collaboration, bringing things together. And when he decides to build it, he says, I need a great engineer, so he gets Presper Eckert, the guy whose grandfather invented the cotton candy machine. He gets 6 women mathematicians to do the programming. He gets about 30 mechanics, and they have a team of about 50 people who build this thing at the University of Pennsylvania, and it becomes ENIAC. So to me, that's the first computer, but you've never heard of John Mauchly, because he's and you've never heard of the 6 women programmers. They're all part of this team. And so it doesn't lend itself to the man who invented the computer narrative.
What about this idea of different kinds of personalities in these duos, which are a little bit different from what we were talking about before?
No, but that's, yeah,
But
definitely.
Wozniak and
Well, what you need is a visionary to begin with. That's Markley, that's Steve Jobs, that's Bob Noyce. But vision without execution is hallucination. So you need somebody who can execute. And so you always need to get Markley with Eckert, visionary and an engineer. Wozniak with Jobs, Paul Allen with Bill Gates, Bob Noyce with Andy Grove. Somebody's got to get the microchips out the door.
By the way, Andy Grove, your description of Andy Grove is just terrific. Mind if I read this? What saved Grove from seeming like a tyrant was that he was so irrepressible, which made him hard not to like. When he smiled, his eyes lit up. He had a pixie-like charisma. With his Hungarian accent and goofy grin, he was by far the most colorful engineer in the Valley. He succumbed to the dubious fashions of the early 1970s by attempting in an immigrant geek manner worthy of a Saturday Night Live skit to be groovy. He grew his sideburns long and his mustache droopy and wore open shirts and gold chains dangling over his chest hair. So if you've read one of Walter's other books, you know that you're in for this kind of treat. But the other thing that I did bookmark was, since we're talking about the invention we're talking about the invention of the computer rather than the internet. But you say that when I told people I was writing a book about the people who invented computers and the internet, the most predictable quip I got, especially from those who knew little about internet history, was, "Oh, you mean Al Gore?" Yeah. And then they would laugh. But actually, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about Al Gore.
Yeah, I don't know why I felt the need to vaguely defend him, but what happened was...
Especially here.
Yeah. It was a joke. You always get it. But I'll go back to what I was doing. In 1992, I was in charge of new media for Time Inc. And we were on America Online, CompuServe, all these things. And something happens, which is the internet opens up. And people invent things like the World Wide Web and Mosaic browsers. And we take Time Magazine and all the other publications, go off of these proprietary services and into the online world, into the internet world. And I actually got called in by Jerry Levin and Reg Brack, who were my bosses at Time Warner, what was then Time Inc., I guess. And they say, "Well, who owns the internet?" And I think, well, what a bloody clueless question. And then they say, "Well, I mean, who's in charge of it? Who runs it?" And then I realized, A, it was a clueless question, and B, I did not know the answer. So years later, that's one of the motivations of this book. Like, okay, how did this come to be? Right. And to get back to the point where it opens up until 1992, you couldn't get on the internet. If you were at AEI, maybe you could, but you had to be at a research institute that had the right to be on it, and an average person couldn't just dial up and go onto the internet. You go onto AOL and CompuServe, but even on AOL or CompuServe, you couldn't get to the internet at large. You were in that walled garden that they had. The Gore Act of 1992 makes it legal, in fact necessary, that online service and everything else can open up to the internet for everybody. It was called the Eternal September because there was a wonderful phrase called September, which was because every September a whole lot of freshmen would go to universities and they'd be able to get on the internet for the first time, and they'd all misbehave and do dirty jokes, and and eventually they would learn the netiquette and be calmed down enough to actually be on the internet. But all of a sudden in September of '93, after the Gore Act goes into effect, it opens up, and it's called the Eternal September because it wasn't just a month of newbies, but all these newbies came on. So there is an important thing in the book about government doing things in collaboration with industry and academia, but then it opening up so it becomes a wild and wonderfully place where anybody can invent and play. And that actually happened. I don't have to give Gore all the credit, but it happens with the Gore Act of '92 and others that open up the internet for public use.
And
and commercial use too. I mean, you couldn't have .coms until then. And this, people were horrified. Oh my God, companies are commercial. Well, this is great to commercialize the internet as well as to open it up to the unwashed masses.
And I want to get to the policy issues in a second, but it does remind me what you're saying about something you say about Tim Berners-Lee who invented the World Wide Web, that originally he wanted two-way links with approval.
Well, that gets into both
communicate.
policy and to me, journalism, if we may become more parochial, and goes back to our former trade. As you know, a hyperlink, you can just put it and you can hyperlink to your website, but I don't need your permission and you don't even know I've linked to you. There's no backlinks. One of the things that Larry Page does is he invents backrub, which is a way to at least know, to crawl the web and know where the links are coming, but there's still no backlinks. You can't go back and forth. Tim Berners-Lee and the early protocols, and especially Ted Nelson, who invented the notion of hypertext, wanted it to be two-way. Now, that makes things slightly complicated because I'd need your permission maybe, or you could block it, but that's not a big deal. What would have been good is, let us say you have Real Clear Politics that's linking all over the place and making money with all the ads. If you had two-way links and they were using your content, you could have a mini payment or micro payment or ASCAP royalty type thing where the royalty gets shared because people know which links are coming in and out. So two-way links would have been connected in Tim Berners-Lee's version to a royalty or payment system so that the producers of the content who got linked to, just like if your song is played on an AM radio station, you get a quarter of a penny or something, there could have been a business model that would have made it so that it wouldn't have been advertising only.
But you're not completely convinced that that would have been better than the way it's turned out.
I do think it was an original sin that I made the mistake, among others. There were 4 or 5 of us who went online in 1993 when we could, and we were going to make it so there would be some micropayment system, but suddenly you could look out of the Time Life building windows and see people coming from Madison Avenue with bags of money trying to buy banner ads because they didn't want to be clueless, they wanted to be in. And so we decided, no, we'll never charge for content because we'll keep the content free and monetize it through the eyeballs, which was, I think, a bad mistake because the number of avails goes up exponentially, meaning the number of websites goes up from 700 the year we went on the web, January 94, to 10,000 by the end of the year. So you can see that the demand for advertising doesn't go up. There are not more Chevrolets being introduced or Procter & Gamble products, but the number of avails goes up exponentially, so the CPMs go down. And that became a business model that disrupted, perhaps okay, but disrupted mainstream journalism for a decade. I do think if we had found some micro-payment system, and we will, Bitcoin is a flawed system, but the demand for it leads you to smell that there could be a cyber currency in which people could just pay a nickel or a dime or a quarter for an AEI journal or, a Time magazine. And I'm hoping that will happen.
We'll look into that.
Yeah.
That nickel, I don't know. Nickel may be too much for an AEI journal. So
we pay people at the Aspen Institute to read our publications.
Speaking of Tim Berners-Lee, okay, so when you look at your book and you look at the history of computers and the internet, it really is almost all Americans or immigrants to the United States, plus a bunch of Brits, especially in the early stages.
Touring Tim Berners-Lee.
Yeah. But I mean, but Babbage and
Babbage,
Lovelace
Turing,
Turing and that sort of thing. So why is that?
Well, this is something, you and AEI and you and I from BBG and others, I think and understand. I try to make it a sub-theme in the book because I want the reader to try to ask that question instead of me to preach. But it is in countries that are comfortable with the free flow of information, that allow individual freedom, allow failure to happen, allow people to get venture capital on their 3rd round, even after 4 rounds of, after rounds of failure, that don't try to censor or control or regulate how it will happen. France comes up, I don't do much in the book, but in 1992 when I'm doing it, everybody's saying, hey, don't go on the World Wide Web. France has invented Minitel.
Right.
I said, well, screw it, Minitel is controlled by the government. That ain't gonna work. Oh no, Minitel's cool. Well, no, there's nobody in this room except for, people over the age of 60 who even remember Minitel. Right. You have to have free flow of information. You have to have a somewhat unregulated or free environment for invention. You have to have venture capital that's willing to let people to fail. You have to have a lack of a desire to try to censor or control everything. The web, by its very nature, and the internet, by its internet protocols, is not only not centralized, it's not even decentralized. It's totally distributed. Each and every node on the web has equal power to store and forward packets. When you do that, there is nobody who can have a switch and control it. Now, I mean, the Chinese can try pretty hard and they can censor Google, but I remember in '92 when I was doing what I was doing, I go over to Kashgar, which is in the western part of China. I mean, and we're there, and they're actually online at this little cafe, and I go and I try to type in time.com, and of course, it's blocked. Finally, some kid elbows me aside, and I said, what'd you do? He said, oh, we know how to go through proxy servers in Hong Kong that the censors are clueless about. So there will be that struggle, but in China, they still generally successfully control the flow of information and ideas. And in France, they regulate it all. So what environment allows you to succeed? Well, ever since, Thomas Paine was able to get a printing press from Ben Franklin and hand out pamphlets on the streets of Philadelphia, we've been comfortable with allowing the free and uncensored flow of information and not regulating. I don't want to influence your communication and technology program,
no, you're right,
but not overly regulating.
Right on the theme.
Although I'm not sure I agree with, I still conflicted on net neutrality. So
I was going to ask you about that. You won't be able to escape. But let me ask it in a more general way. So you talked about 1992, Al Gore and others helping kind of liberate the internet, so it could become commercial and more. But also around the same time, maybe a few years later, under President Clinton, a decision was made by the FCC and really out of the White House to not regulate the internet as though it were the telephone company,
right.
As though we're a common carrier, to put it.
Right, and not make it a common carrier.
Right. Now it seems that there's a movement back in the opposite direction.
And that you get to net neutrality. The difference between AEI and the Aspen Institute is that you're all always sure of one opinion, and we're always conflicted and all messed up.
No.
I am conflicted.
We have very open minds.
The problem with the implication of your question, which is, shouldn't we just allow it to be unregulated, is that you do not have a free and open market now in internet service providers. In Manhattan, where I've just gotten a little apartment, I have one choice, Time Warner Cable, if I want broadband.
Well, that's very apt in your case.
Yes, right. I know.
Maybe that's just for you.
It's God's punishment, and he finds it amusing that I work with Time Warner Cable, and now try to cut the cord and can't. Here in Washington, you have basically either Comcast or the phone company. That's it. And you do not, in my mind, when you don't have a marketplace competition, want to allow the people who control the pipeline to also favor or control the flow of the content. Why? Even if you get them to agree, if Comcast and Time Warner merge, they've got to make sure they don't discriminate against ABC or whatever. Who knows what's going on? CBS then starts a streaming news service that tries to break the cable model by going around. Who's to say that Comcast, Time Warner Cable would let it flow at the same speed, because you see what the cable companies do. They get into fights with Fox and CNN or whatever about carriage. And so if you could have at least 3 or 4 or 5 pipelines into the home,
okay. I see what you're saying.
then you would not have to regulate it. I would be against any form of regulation if the government could just do things. And I don't know what. I've tried to study it. Open up more broadband spectrum, take some of the emergency spectrum, and take some of the TV broadcast spectrum being unused, and just say, we're going to sell it off so that you have other ways of getting into the home. But obviously, it is a somewhat natural monopoly. You're not going to have 2 pieces of fiber or coax from the curb under your sidewalk into the house. And so when you have a natural monopoly I'm not sure I want that monopolist to say, okay, now I don't know, somebody else has come up with a new form of Twitter or new form of video or Instagrams or whatever, and YouTube will be favored, but it won't, or whatever. You want to say, let's have some neutrality of what goes through the pipes, unless consumers have many choices. That said, I could poke holes in all the arguments I just made, but I don't know the best way to do it, and I'm not sure the best way is just say, let the dominant pipeline companies, meaning the cable companies, decide that the HuffPo gets favored, but Daily Beast doesn't, or somebody who invents a streaming sports site, ESPN can make a deal with Comcast to say, we'll let you carry ESPN, but you got to give us higher speeds in this new startup. It suppresses startups, is a short form of what I would say, if you have neither net neutrality nor marketplace competition.
So let me maybe ask this in a slightly different way to you as a historian. Do you think that the light, let's call it light touch regulation of the last 20 years or so has been a major factor in the internet boom and the fact that really so much of this has been emanating from the United States?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, and the long answer is absolutely yes.
Okay, all right. So the issue that you bring up is, at this point, probably has not been a problem historically.
It's been a problem with television. In other words, I can't get TV in Manhattan unless I pay not only the $90 that the whole bundle does, but pay 24 of those bucks for ESPN channels that I may or may not want. Mm-hmm. And so I do not have, and if I'm when Fox News came on, they had to fight. Now they were able to do so, mm-hmm. But let us suppose, not that I'm a supporter of Al Jazeera, because I hated them both ever since BBG days and CNN days, but let us suppose Al Jazeera can't get on the cable bundle, which it can't in most mm-hmm. places. Is that really good? Now, I shouldn't have picked Al Jazeera, because I think, it actually is pretty good.
But America is actually pretty good.
Right, I was going to say that. But I could probably pick a better example, which is
RT.
Yeah, a startup. Somebody does a startup that wants to compete with the, major network, right. And they can't get part of the cable bundle. So we see what happens, and I love David Cohen, I love Comcast, everything else, but Comcast, and often helps fund all sorts of things. But mm-hmm. You see, when they control the bundle, I have less choice, and even worse, there's less entrepreneurship and startup and innovation, because you cannot create a cable channel unless you make a deal with Comcast and Time Warner now. And so that means people in their garages are not inventing cable channels. Fine, they're inventing streaming web services, mm-hmm. But if the same thing happens to streaming web services that happens to television, that I think is not good for innovation. Am I making sense there? Yeah.
You're making sense. I don't necessarily agree with every word
yeah.
you said.
I'm not sure. I wake up in the morning.
Maybe you don't either.
Yeah. As I say, I could poke holes in the argument, but I know people trying to start mm-hmm. Internet services, video services on the net, and it is harder to do so if. Look at Netflix. Talk to Reed Hastings, a great entrepreneur, great startup.
Right.
He is now totally beholden and absolutely fearful of the fact that Comcast could crush him if he doesn't make a deal. Look at Amazon.
But
these are very
he worked his
innovative.
Way. One of the themes of your book is people run into these brick walls and then they kind of work their way around. And,
yeah.
In a way, that's what Reed Hastings did when he started Netflix, and now maybe he's
hit another brick wall, yeah. Which is, if he wants his Netflix video to get into my house here, he's got to have a deal with Comcast.
But there are other ways for him to get into
that's
your house.
My point.
But I want to open this up
okay.
Well,
if there were other ways, I would totally agree with you. For me, I think there are only two methods, Verizon and Comcast for
Well,
me to
there's
get
over
broadband
the top,
video.
there's Voodoo, and there's
I keep looking around for now maybe in Georgetown or whatever, and you can't tear up sidewalks. It's very hard for me to get broadband except for those two providers. But I
Okay,
may be wrong.
Let's
But
open
last
it
year I
up to,
wasn't
to
wrong 'cause
other
I
to
looked
this
around.
this highly expert audience.
Who will
have.
now decimate my opinions.
And just wait for the microphone and tell us who you are.
Yeah, hi, my name's Dave Price, retired journalist. Walter, question. Your book takes us, up to now. So as you sit there today, maybe your 2 or 3 biggest fears, and then what you see positively happening past today, both.
Yeah, I
And
think
choose whichever you want to do first.
Yeah, I'll do the positive first. I do think, as I hinted at earlier, that we've had a broken business model for journalism for the past 10 years. People say, journalism is in bad shape, it's horrible. No, we have more journalism now than ever in our lifetimes. I mean, it's just astonishing. Something happens in Paris, I've got 42 different sources, and I'm feeding it today and hearing, and seeing. But the business model ain't great because Time Magazine and CBS and NBC don't have Paris bureaus anymore, nor does New York Times does, but nor does the Washington Post. So you could say the business model is broken, but so to me, the upside is there will be, in the next 2 or 3 years, ways to do cyber currencies that allow micropayments that I think will be a golden age for journalism, because it won't just help mainstream media. If you're a really cool, enterprising reporter and you get into Syria and you're doing really great work and you want people to pay for your blog rather than get it for free, and you just say, I'm here, but I'm either asking for, demanding, or requesting $1 every time you read it, and people just click because it's like an easy pass going through, to Baltimore or something. You just, boom, you don't have to stop and wait and put in your PayPal number and click your password. It's just like, fine, if it's $1 or under, just say yes as I go through these toll booths. That will be a business model that if I'm writing a song, a play, a blog from Syria, I can get compensated. So I think that's really good. I think that the downsides I worry about do fall in this category of the glories of an unregulated internet, but then the dark sides of it that are going to cause people to want to regulate it, but I'm not sure that's good either. I have a piece coming out tomorrow in Time Magazine that will cause controversy, and I almost chickened out on it. But it says it's time to build a parallel internet, a alternative internet, which they could have done when Tim Berners-Lee did it or whatever, in which you have secure domain IDs, and if somebody sends you an email, there's a secure signature, and you can trace where the packets came from. So if somebody says, I'm your Aunt Lois from Bugaloosa, and I'm stuck in Nigeria, and I've lost my wallet, will you wire money to this address? I can see whether that's a verified, and likewise, if you're Sony and you're getting incoming stuff, you can say, I'm only going to be on the secure net where nobody's anonymous. Anonymity is really cool on the internet, but anonymity is also really uncool on the internet. And so if we had 2 nets, or we had the internet, but we also had a secure sets of protocols, that if you look at the RFC process, which is how the internet was built and is being built, there are 2 of them now for domain name authentication keys and stuff. So I could say, all right, normally I just want to be on the regular internet, and I want to be able to be anonymous when I post on the AEI site or whatever. But for all my banking and all, I want to have this secure internet, and I want to know that it's me and my banker talking, not somebody else intervening. And I think that's a dark side that I worry about, which is 40 million Americans had data stolen this past year. $100 billion was the direct cost to the economy, not counting, we got hacked at Aspen Institute by the Chinese, it's all sorts of mass.
BBG?
No, Aspen Institute got hacked. And BBG, I'm sure gets hacked. And so I think the internet is almost collapsing of its own weight, because half the emails I get every day, even that make it through my spam filter, are phishing, or, and they get more and more sophisticated, like, here's your Amazon gift card, and then boom, So I worry about that. The things I worry about is the internet has become so polluted because of its anonymity. And the fact, as I said in the early development of the internet, is that every packet can go anywhere into any node and be forwarded without any trace back of which nodes it came from. So it's hard to figure out how to do protocols that will trace back the nodes, but it only took Vint Cerf, Bob Kahn, and their crowd 9 months to invent the internet, with all due respect to Al Gore. I'm sure given 9 months, if you crowdsourced it, you could have a set of secure protocols for the internet, which would cause a lot of people to scream bloody murder, because it would stop the trolling and anonymity, because you could just say, I just don't even want to go on that dark part of the internet.
Other questions? Yeah, Rob.
I'll try to be shorter in my answer.
No, that's good.
Hi, I'm Bob Hershey. I'm an alumnus of Bell Telephone Laboratories, which you mentioned in the book. Could you tell us a little bit more about Bell Labs' connection to all this?
Yeah, I mean, Bell Labs is the ultimate example of collaboration, and what I believe in, and by the way, Mercer Mayer and Larry Page believe in, which is place-based collaboration. It can't all be done by Skype or whatever. And in Bell Labs, both when it was on West Street in Manhattan or right after the war when it moves to Murray Hill, they do something brilliant, which is instead of having a building for the semiconductor unit, a building for the material scientists, and a building for the people doing amplification of telephone signals, it's one huge thing in corridors that are big and open, and they mix people up. So Claude Shannon, the greatest information theorist, is riding a unicycle up and down the corridors of Bell Labs, juggling balls, but also knowing and working with Alan Turing of how you use Boolean algebra to do on-off signals in a circuit switch to do logic. At the same time, you got Walter Bratton, who is a material scientist who can take a piece of silicon and say, if I dope it with boron like this, in this way, and put a paper clip through it, I can turn it into an on-off switch in this particular way. And you have William Shockley, who's a bit of a nutcase by the end, and John Bardeen, who's a great quantum theorist, saying, they're imagining how on the surface state of the silicon the electrons are dancing. And you have, as I say, the pole climbers with grease under their fingernails who say, I got to amplify a phone signal from here to San Francisco. You got to make solid states. I don't have to do vacuum tubes in order to do it. You put those people together, you invent the transistor, you invent the laser. You also, because it was a both monopoly and regulated, which is a worst combination. It's like being Time Warner Cable, which is a monopoly, and a regulated. They invent those things, but they can't really capitalize on them. They don't build the first computer with the first transistors. They don't take the laser and make CDs or anything. But it's glorious. The other point I make about Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, or whatever, we had, and this is something that's a policy question, we had, starting with Eisenhower in particular, when he was funding things at Bell Labs, Lincoln Labs, Xerox PARC, you name it, a way in which government was helping fund basic research, with Vannevar Bush and others helping Eisenhower figure out, with the basic research, things will happen, like transistors, but they didn't know that. The ARPANET and internet, they didn't know it. But they were doing the basic research. And as Vannevar Bush said in his report, that's the seed corn for future innovations. And so there was a funding of basic research that the government, after Los Alamos and after the war, decided brilliantly, or Vannevar Bush did, and then Eisenhower did, not to put it in government, to have government labs, but to have private corporations and private universities, Bell Labs, MIT, Xerox PARC, Stanford, do the research, and you have an explosion of innovation and creativity. This is something, I don't know if it goes down well at AEI or not.
We're for basic research.
Yeah, but the decimation by everything from the sequester to the budget cuts and everything else of basic research funding is put in the category of things I really worry about. I was at the Broad Institute at MIT, where they're doing folding of proteins and how it affects viruses and RNA and how it deals with it. And they were saying 4 years ago that they were cutting off their research on doing it on certain types of viruses because with the sequester, you needed to guarantee 5 years of funding, or otherwise you couldn't open up and hire for a lab. And so I would say this story, and I get into rooms like this, be, well, okay, you know, liberal who wants more funding of research. Then Ebola comes along, and we're clueless about how the RNA of the Ebola virus is folded and how you could disrupt it. And you say, I get it. The basic research is something that we still need. So I would hope, and this is something, it's not partisan. Paul Ryan, and Newt Gingrich, deeply in favor of the basic research funding, but there are a lot of people, as you know, in Congress who just want to get rid of NIH or get rid of the National Science Foundation. And I think that would be a mistake.
So you think in general that we're not spending enough on basic research?
Yeah, and it's not just government's not, but obviously universities having major cutbacks for a variety of reasons. I mean, from endowments to, you know, the cost of, because they haven't controlled the cost of the semi-useless thing they do, which is teaching undergraduates. They've let the cost of that get out of hand, so they have to cut back on the important things like the research they do. That was partly ironic, but don't tweet that one out, because Twitter doesn't have a sense of humor and they'll think I meant that. But there's a lot of reasons we're cutting back on, but no, I mean, it's not like I think we're cutting back on basic research. I know, I mean, it is 40% of the amount of money spent on basic research now that was spent 12 years ago. And by the way, that was in the George W. administration, which was very much in favor of basic research. So it's not a partisan thing, but it has just been, I say decimated, but decimated means cut 10%. By 90%, but it's been whatever.
10%. Oh, 90%.
Yeah, what decimated means it's 1/10 of what it used to be.
Oh,
well, maybe, I could be wrong. But this is quadrimated, which is 40% of what it used to be. And this is really bad.
Yeah. Other questions? Just think there was somebody who had a hand up over here. Yeah, go ahead.
But I didn't know if you wanted to take it back to your comments of journalism.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
We have 3 we're covering journalism.
Eileen Schlepp, I'm a journalist and a communicator and a teacher. One of the major concerns we have at the National Press Club, where I'm active, and I can quote Frank Mankiewicz in his absence, is that we have a lot of 24/7 chatter, but people are tuning into the chatter that meets what they really believe, and nothing's regulated anymore as far as what are the facts. So we may be getting news from around the world, but how do we start regulating? And if we're going to bring back a journalism that really impacts on the country, what do we do?
We don't regulate, ever. Never regulate the flow of information. And we don't try to control the flow of information. As I said, we have it in our DNA as a country that we're pretty good at this. When Payne is putting out Common Sense and there are 15 other pamphlets on the streets of Philadelphia, people of Philadelphia finally figure out what they believe about, you think. With a free flow of information, we have to not try to control that, but have a populace that's able to figure out. And I know, people are better educated now. You say, oh, but they're going to get bad things out of some stupid website. No, I don't think that happens. People are not as dumb as they look. Yeah.
I don't mean regulating, I mean fact.
Yeah, that's what you should do every day. Every time I mean, there are ways to fact check. But I don't think you can impose fact checking on an outside organization. But I think other organizations, I think the Washington Post can do a fact check thing and say Fox News or MSNBC was wrong, but I think you ought to keep that in the spirit of openness. Yeah.
Okay. There's a
Actually, it's a good question. I was a little bit too I mean, I get where you're coming from, and I am sympathetic. Yeah.
So, hello, Mr. Isaacson. My name is Braun Katz. I'm a nonprofit worker and an amateur hacker. And just this week, I finished up the Jobs biography, which was very mind-blowing and taught me to be more blunt. So I'm just going to be blunt with my question, which is one of the things that was most mind-blowing was just kind of the rough edges of Jobs' personality. And in your research of innovators, very successful innovators, have you found that to be a common characteristic? Or is it possible to be
I
an
got asked
innovator?
this yesterday because I was with Jeff Immelt doing some GE thing. And no, you don't, I mean, I hope you don't mind bad language. I don't know where we're being streamed
No,
to.
we like
But the ultimate question, over and over in the book, Woz asks it, Hertzfeld asks it, and then I asked it to Steve is, did you have to be such an asshole? And that is a question that you have to read the book, and people come to different conclusions. And some people say, hey, I'm like Steve Jobs. When somebody does something that sucks, I just tell them off, you know. I say, yeah, but did you ever invent the iPod? Maybe you don't have the right to be so mean. On the other hand, people, you know, if you've read the whole book, you realize it's kind of mind-blowing because he has rough edges, but he's charismatic. People then become part of his team and deeply loyal. So how does that work? That's more than just being an asshole. Mm-hmm. So he's a complicated character. I don't think he had to be as mean as rough as he was on people. But I do think each person has to work that out. You can find really great leaders who are very nice. But what the common characteristic of great leaders is, because Bob Noyce was Steve's mentor, and Bob Noyce was the nicest Congregationalist ever to come out of a Congregational church. Nobody ever said that about Steve. But Bob Noyce, being really nice, knew he had to have a partner named Andy Grove, who was not a Congregationalist. He had swum to freedom by swimming across the river to escape the communists after having done so with the Nazis. So, you know, he didn't grow up in Iowa singing madrigals in a Congregational church. Likewise, Steve needs a Tim Cook to be a partner. I do ask Steve this at the end of the book, since you've gotten to the end, you know, which is, did you have to be such a jerk, as I put it? And he said, look, maybe, and he joked about it, on the East Coast where you live, people wear velvet gloves. I don't know what he was thinking. And they speak in such a sweet way, and they never tell the truth. But I don't know how to do that. I'm brutally honest, and when something sucks, I tell people it sucks, and we get things done. And I think that's the best way to do it. You may say that's not necessary, fine, but that's who I am. You know, and Woz said he didn't have to be that way. He could have been nicer, he could have been sweeter. And then Woz said, if I'd run Apple, I would have been nicer and sweeter. And then Woz pauses and says, but if I had run Apple, we probably wouldn't have been able to do the Macintosh. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. But the other, you know, all the people that you talk about in the book, it's quite clear that they don't have to have a personality like Steve Jobs to accomplish what
I do think you have to be a bit of a rebel, question authority. Mm-hmm. Einstein does it, Ben Franklin does it, you know, Steve Jobs does it, Bill Gates does it, even Bob Noyce or Larry Page. So there is no way you can do backlinks from everything on the web. He said, don't tell me that, I am going to do it. And, you know, and they do things. I mean, Einstein reads the first sentence of the Principia, and Newton says, you know, time marches along irrespective of how we observe it. And Einstein says, how do we know that? You know, that doesn't, you know, I want to test that. Yeah. So there's a rebellious streak. All of them, by the way, all the ones I mentioned, drop out of school and run away. This is why I don't give graduation speeches, because everybody, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, Wozniak, Jobs, Bill Gates, Ben Franklin, Einstein, they all like, okay, they got enough received wisdom and they're out of there before they graduate. So you have to, as Steve
wants to institutionalize that.
Yeah, right. You have to be, as Steve Jobs would say, think different.
Yeah. Okay.
Judith Hellstein, Hellstein Associates. I want to go back to your earlier talk about an environment that is more trusted, where we could trust. And I think the question is that there is such an environment, but the U.S. and a lot of places have not moved there. We have not moved to IPv6. We have not adopted DNSSEC. There's a recent, and money, the reason is money and the cost. And that is also one thing. And one of the big movements now to try to get consumers to adopt these is the recent work by Electronic Frontier and others in trying to get a cost-efficient certificates for everyone. And
yeah, but
and
if
that
you look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they are against reducing the anonymity on the internet. The IPv6 and all is not quite the same over on. At the very basic of what I'm talking about is if you're online and you do something, you're no longer anonymous. I can ask the former chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors why there are two sides to that. Because when I was at the BBG, we were trying to find anonymizers for people who were Tibetan
Right.
dissidents and others in
Right,
China
right.
who wanted to make sure they stayed anonymous. So granting people anonymity, whether they're some transgendered teenager in Kansas City or a dissident in China, gives a freedom of empowerment to the internet. And if you allow a system where people can't be anonymous, then that could drive out anonymity. And so it's a tough call here.
No.
I have now finally tipped to the fact that I think we should have at least an overlay of the internet where people who want to could say, I want to have a secure identity.
I would say that could be, there's a lot of ways people still can be anonymous, but at least we won't be as attacked by phishing and others if we had upgraded our infrastructure and if we made it affordable for nonprofits or consumers to buy certificates and buy them
Well,
inexpensive.
you may be right. Thanks.
Okay. Right here.
I'm curious, of the personalities that you studied in the book, who do you think were the most underrated, that you wish had a higher profile in the public imagination, like a Steve Jobs?
Well, Ada Lovelace, and I don't mean to sound politically correct because I'm now citing some women, because I think women did get written out of history. I'll take one example. There's a woman named Jean Jennings in my book, who I'd never heard of, and most people had never heard of. Jean Jennings grew up in Atlantis Grove, Missouri, a town of about 107, 8 of whom were her siblings. She was 9 kids in her family. And very poor farm family. But she decided she wanted to be a mathematician. And she gets to go to Northwest Missouri College, becomes a mathematician. The day she graduates, she sees right before she graduates, she sees an ad on the bulletin board saying, women mathematicians needed, come to Philadelphia. It's World War II. And she goes there, and they're doing ENIAC. And she becomes one of the secret programmers of ENIAC. And she's the one who, when they finally do the demonstration, where they have to take it from being just a ballistic missile test, but also John von Neumann has come from Los Alamos, and he wants to do an implosion test for the next version of the atom bomb, not the super or the H-bomb. She's doing all those things because men, with the boys with their toys, thought the hardware was the important thing. The women realized that actually programming the hardware was going to be more important in the long run. They were right. So they come up with COBOL and all these programming languages. Now, she does it. They finally demonstrate, and they have a great celebration with all the dignitaries from Washington there and the military. And then in Houston Hall at Penn that night, they have a candlelit dinner. And they didn't invite the 6 women. It was an all-male dinner. It was Valentine's night, February 46, and they take the bus back to their apartments. And you very rarely read about these women who did the programming. I think they are very underrated because in the end, the hardware wiring, whether it was a UNIVAC or Sperry Rand or Honeywell or whatever, was somewhat irrelevant. It was how you created the software to deal with it. So that would be the thing I would look at for the underrated. I'll give you 100 more examples. The book is filled with people you've probably, well, maybe you've heard of, but most people have probably never heard of because I think, whoa, Vint Cerf should be better known, or Grace Hopper should be better known, even Alan Turing.
Well, I know there are a lot more questions, but
I'll stick around,
we're out
I'm
of
sorry.
time.
And let me
Thank
go
you.
back to the press. I did not mean to be so abrupt on that. I do worry about
I think
bad
it's great.
information driving out good, but I'm still on the side that in the competition of a lot of information, good will eventually drive out bad. But there are mornings I worry. Yeah, I am worried too, and I did give short shrift to your questions, so I want to apologize.
But I like the visceral way that you reacted to the word regulation. Because
I know,
it's very
I
appropriate.
just think we have
being
to
here.
regulate ourselves in what we read, that there's no outside force that can do it. But I know you weren't suggesting that. I just think, I do think that it's good for a lot of journalists to call out other journalists that are doing bad things. And sometimes in our journalism game, we're a little bit too polite. We don't say, this the New York Times so blew this. Actually, we're not polite anymore. The attacks on journalists, Twitter has made that a blood sport.
That's true.
All right, that's
You
right.
and I are still
We
polite.
want one more?
No, we
Okay.
don't have enough time because it's 6:29 and I was told to end at 6:25 to give you some time to sign some books. Because I just want to tell everyone.
books out there if
we've got
you
this
want 'em.
It is a fabulous book. In fact, I meant to read what the Guardian says. It is a story told lucidly, thrillingly, and above all, amusingly. And I think that's absolutely true. So buy the book. Thank you, Walter, for coming.
Thank you,
He
Jim.
will sign books, and he'll talk to you.
Jim has now paid me back for all the good advice I gave him when I was 17.